My channel is new. Don't forget to subscribe and join the sci-fi adventures. The sky split open like a gaping wound. Its edges burned with violet fire, tearing apart the clouds as the first of the Drekar warships punched through Earth's atmosphere. A deep, unnatural rumble rolled through the air, not just heard, but felt, an unsettling hum that made the very ground quiver. The sun dimmed as colossal metal leviathans blotted out the sky. Their hulls were black as the abyss, jagged with cruel, angular designs that spoke of a civilization forged in endless conquest. Below, the streets of New Geneva, Earth's last great stronghold, fell into an eerie silence. Then, the first explosion came. A fireball bloomed in the heart of the city, shattering glass, tossing vehicles like toys. A shockwave surged through steel and concrete, flattening buildings as the sky filled with smoke and debris. Sirens screamed. Car alarms blared. People ran, but they had nowhere to go. At the top of the United Nations Command Center, Commander Alex Carter watched in silence. His fingers curled tightly around a ceramic mug long gone cold. Through the reinforced glass, he saw his own reflection. A face carved with exhaustion, dark circles shadowing sharp, unreadable eyes. Behind him, the soft glow of tactical monitors flickered, their displays a chaotic mess of red alert signals and static-filled transmissions. "Sir." He didn't turn. "Sir, we've lost communication with Beijing. And Madrid just went dark." Lieutenant Rachel Vaughn's voice was steady, but he could hear the tightness in her breath, the forced control. She stood just behind him, fingers hovering over the holodeble, where Earth's remaining defensive forces blinked on a three-dimensional map. Too few. Far too few. Carter exhaled slowly. "Casualties?" Rachel swallowed. "Unknown." But she hesitated, then forced herself to say it. "Satellite imaging confirms no survivors in Moscow." Carter didn't move. Didn't speak. He had seen this before. A pattern of annihilation. The Drekar didn't just invade, they erased. Outside, the largest of the warships, a hulking obsidian monolith the size of a city district, descended into the ruins of New Geneva. Its underbelly split apart, and from within, the Drekar warriors emerged. General Kraith, supreme warlord of the Drekar Empire, stepped onto human soil like a god surveying the wreckage of a fallen world. His armor, dark as the void, bore crimson etchings that told the stories of 1,000 conquered planets. Each scar on his body was a victory, each engraved symbol a civilization lost. Behind him, rows of Drekar warriors fanned out, their reptilian eyes gleaming under the planet's alien sun. Towering, armored giants, their elongated skulls ridged with ceremonial battle scars. Each moved with predatory grace, their taloned hands resting on plasma-forged weaponry. But the humans didn't kneel. Earth's remaining soldiers, the last line of defense, stood in formation. Their uniforms were battered, their weapons pitiful compared to the advanced Drekar arsenal. Yet they held the line, shoulders squared, jaws clenched. They would not bow. A deep, resonant growl rumbled in Kraith's throat. This should have been easier. How many times had his forces swept through lesser species, crushing them in mere hours? The translator embedded in his armor flickered to life, his voice booming across the ruined streets. "Your resistance is meaningless. Submit, and your extinction will be painless." Silence. Then a voice answered. "You came to the wrong planet, Kraith." Commander Alex Carter stepped forward. He didn't wear a helmet. His uniform was marked with soot, a small cut along his temple still bleeding. But his eyes were clear, sharp, unwavering. Kraith tilted his head slightly, studying the human. This one was different. "You think brute force wins wars," Carter continued, voice calm, almost casual. "That's why you'll lose." The alien warlord's pupils narrowed, unreadable. "Explain." Carter gestured around them. "You expected us to fight like the others. To throw ourselves at you until we broke. That's not how we win." A flicker of irritation or curiosity, it was hard to tell. "We don't dominate our world because we're the strongest," Carter said. "Not because we're the fastest. Not because we have the sharpest claws or the toughest skin. His voice was quiet, but every syllable cut like a blade. "We win because we're the smartest." A faint ripple passed through the Drekkar ranks. Some of them shifted, uneasy. Kraith scoffed. "Empty words." Carter smirked. "Are they?" At that moment, a distant explosion roared through the air. But this wasn't their attack. One of the Drekkar warships, one of their own unbreakable titans, shuddered, flames licking its hull. Then slowly it began to fall. Kraith's head snapped toward the burning wreckage. His comms unit crackled with panic. Primary engine failure, sabotage detected, humans, inside the ship. Kraith's gaze returned to Carter, realization dawning. The humans hadn't launched a desperate last stand. They had infiltrated. Another explosion. Another warship plummeting like a dying star. Drekkar warriors exchanged uneasy glances. The fearless conquerors, the unstoppable force, they had never faced this kind of war before. Carter took a slow step forward. "You were right about one thing. We don't have the firepower to beat you." He let the words hang for a moment. "But we don't need it." Kraith's golden irises burned, something cold and calculating behind them. He had underestimated these creatures. The thought unsettled him. Carter folded his arms. "You came here to rule. To crush us. But let me ask you, Kraith." His voice lowered, like a knife sliding between ribs. "How many battles can you fight when your own soldiers don't trust their commanders anymore?" Silence. "I give it a week before your empire starts to fracture." Kraith bared his razor-sharp teeth. It wasn't a snarl. It was something worse. Understanding. For the first time in his bloodstained career, he saw a species that didn't fight wars the way others did. They didn't challenge strength with strength. They poisoned it from the inside. A war of blades and fire? The Drekkar would have won in hours. But this wasn't a war of weapons. It was a war of minds. And the humans had already begun winning. The first Drekkar warship hit the ground with the force of a dying star. Its metal carcass groaned under the weight of its own collapse, sending a wave of dust and twisted debris surging through the shattered city streets. The wreckage burned, black smoke rising like a funeral shroud against the fractured skyline of New Geneva. From his vantage point in the United Nations Command Center, Commander Alex Carter watched the beast fall. His expression remained unreadable, but inside, he felt the first ripple of something dangerous: hope. The sabotage had worked. Kraith hadn't spoken for a long time. The towering Drekkar warlord stood motionless, watching his ship, a vessel that had once terrorized galaxies, now reduced to a smoldering ruin. The weight of it settled across his broad shoulders. Not rage, not yet. Recognition. He turned to Carter, golden eyes narrowing. "Your people should be running." His voice was measured, but the hint of something colder edged beneath. Carter tilted his head. "You don't understand us at all, do you?" Kraith studied him. In all his years of conquest, species reacted the same way: fear, panic, desperate surrender. But the humans? They stood. They fought with silence, with strategies hidden beneath confident smirks and steady eyes. Their defiance wasn't arrogance. It was certainty. Kraith clenched his jaw, barely perceptible. "How?" Carter exhaled, rolling his shoulders. "You underestimated us." His voice was calm, almost casual, as if explaining a simple truth. "That was your first mistake." Another detonation rumbled in the distance. Another Drekkar warship crippled, descending in a spiral of fire. The towering alien warriors around Kraith exchanged uneasy glances, their rigid formation faltering for the first time. It spread like a virus. Kraith turned sharply to one of his officers, barking a command in his guttural native tongue. The warrior flinched before snapping to attention. A moment later, Kraith's personal communicator buzzed to life. "Hi, Warlord," a voice crackled, filled with static. "Our fleet is compromised. Human operatives are aboard at least 6 of our ships. We don't know how they gained access." Carter gave a half-smile, tilting his head as if listening in. Kraith's gaze snapped back to him. "You planned this." It wasn't a question. "Of course," Carter said. For the first time, the mighty warlord felt something alien crawl beneath his skin: uncertainty. The Drekkar were warriors, bred for battle, raised to crush and consume. They had faced thousands of enemies, toppled empires that had stood for centuries. But they had never fought something like this. A war they couldn't see. A battle waged from the inside out. Kraith turned to his warriors. He could feel the shift, the silent, creeping fracture in their ranks. If humans had infiltrated the fleet so easily, what else had they compromised? His forces were mighty, but doubt was a blade sharper than any human weapon. You think this will break us? Kraith asked, voice low, dangerous. Carter met his gaze without flinching. No, but it's the first crack in the foundation. Silence stretched between them, thick, charged. Kraith had seen worlds burn, had stood in the ruins of 100 civilizations, yet this moment, felt different. Carter wasn't bluffing, and that made him the most dangerous opponent Kraith had ever faced. A voice broke through the tension. Commander, Lieutenant Rachel Vaughn's voice was clipped but urgent as she strode up to him. Her sharp blue eyes flickered toward Kraith before she held out a small holopad. We just intercepted a transmission from the Drekkar High Command. You'll want to see this. Kraith's eyes narrowed. Carter took the device without breaking eye contact. He pressed the command to play the transmission, and a voice, cold and commanding, filled the air. Kraith has failed. The warlord went still. The invasion is compromised. The humans are too problematic. High Command is preparing contingency measures. If he cannot bring Earth to its knees, we will do it ourselves. The planet is expendable. Kraith's claws flexed. A faint crack echoed through the air, his fists tightening so hard his gauntlet strained. Carter's gaze sharpened. Looks like you have a problem. For the first time, Kraith said nothing. The weight of the transmission settled into the cold air. The Drekkar did not forgive failure. Kraith had led invasions across the stars. He had torn monarchs from thrones, crushed civilizations beneath his heel, but never, not once, had his leadership been questioned. Until now. His warriors had heard the message too. Doubt thickened. Carter saw it. He seized the moment like a blade. You thought you were in control of this invasion, Carter said. But they don't trust you anymore. Do they? He took a step forward, lowering his voice to something quieter. Sharper. They'll burn this planet just to erase your failure. Kraith's jaw clenched. And that was when Carter knew. He had just changed the war. Silence stretched. Then Kraith did something unexpected. He laughed. A low, dark chuckle. Not amusement, not anger, but something colder. Resignation. Perhaps we underestimated you, he said, voice calm. Too calm. Carter didn't move, but he felt the shift in the air. The war had just become something else. Kraith turned, barking a command in Drekkar. His warriors hesitated for only a second before falling into formation. Their movements were measured, precise, but the energy had changed. The power dynamic had shifted. Carter knew it. Kraith knew it. This wasn't an invasion anymore. It was a reckoning. You think this war is over? Kraith's golden eyes burned as he met Carter's gaze one last time. You're wrong. Then, without another word, the Drekkar forces withdrew. And for the first time since the sky had burned, humanity exhaled. But Carter? He knew better. The real war was just beginning. The fires still smoldered in New Geneva, curling black smoke into the sky like a dying beast exhaling its final breath. Ash and dust coated every surface, clinging to the ruins of a city that had once been a symbol of human resilience. Now, it stood half buried in rubble, streets littered with shattered concrete, twisted steel, and the bodies of the fallen, human and Drekkar alike. The war had not ended. The war had simply changed shape. Commander Alex Carter stood on the rooftop of the United Nations Command Center, staring up at the Drekkar fleet, which still hung in orbit like a storm waiting to break. The battle had forced them back, but they had not left. That was the part that unsettled him. Victory had been an illusion. Rachel Vaughn's voice cut through the evening wind. They're still watching. Carter didn't look away from the sky. No. They're waiting. Rachel stepped beside him, arms crossed, the flickering fires below reflecting in her sharp blue eyes. She held out a data tablet, But Carter barely acknowledged it. Something didn't fit. The Drek'Kar had lost ground, but Kraith had not fought to the death. That was the problem. The Drek'Kar did not abandon their wars. If Kraith had pulled back, it wasn't fear that had forced him into retreat. It was strategy. And that meant something far worse was coming. Rachel exhaled, shifting her weight. High Command is pressing for a counterstrike. They think this is our best chance to hit them while they're vulnerable. Carter finally turned to her, his expression unreadable. Vulnerable? He let the word hang, then gave a dry, humorless chuckle. Kraith isn't vulnerable. She hesitated. It's an opportunity. Carter shook his head, his voice turning sharp. It's bait. Rachel frowned. How can you be sure? He tapped the data tablet. The holographic projections showed enemy movements in orbit. Too precise. Too methodical. Instead of regrouping for an attack, they were repositioning, reinforcing, protecting. They aren't preparing for another invasion, Carter murmured. Rachel narrowed her eyes. Then what are they doing? Carter stared at the display, his gut tightening. They're not advancing. They're consolidating. And then it hit him. They're defending, he whispered. Rachel looked at him like he'd lost his mind. Defending? Against who? We just fought them off. Not against us, Carter muttered. He scrolled through intercepted transmissions, his mind racing. Kraith's not repositioning for a second strike. He's losing control of his own fleet. Rachel's face paled. You're saying there's a mutiny? Carter exhaled. This wasn't just a setback for Kraith. The Drek'Kar weren't regrouping. They were fracturing. This is more than a mutiny, he said quietly. This is a coup. Rachel stiffened. Are you sure? Carter nodded. The sabotage worked. We didn't just cripple their fleet, we shattered their chain of command. Some of them are turning on Kraith. A cold silence stretched between them. Rachel folded her arms. Then we let them tear themselves apart. Carter's jaw tightened. No. If Kraith falls, the next warlord won't negotiate. He won't strategize. He'll just burn Earth down to prove a point. Rachel didn't look convinced. Kraith led a genocide. You really think the next guy's going to be worse? Yes, Carter said without hesitation. Kraith is a warlord, but he's a rational one. He fights to win, not to destroy. If his empire is collapsing, the ones who take over won't be strategists. They'll be extremists. Rachel exhaled slowly, rubbing her temples. So we have two options. Either we sit back and let the Drek'Kar rip each other apart, or we make sure Kraith wins. She looked at him like he'd suggested cutting a deal with the devil. Are you hearing yourself? She snapped. You want us to help the bastard who tried to wipe us out? Carter didn't flinch. I want to make sure we don't replace a conqueror with a fanatic. Rachel shook her head. High Command won't approve this. They'll go for the kill. They'll be walking into a trap, Carter said. Kraith won't let us finish him off. He'll force his fleet into one last suicidal assault before we can touch him. Rachel exhaled sharply. So how do we get Kraith to listen? Carter turned back to the skyline. We don't appeal to trust, he said. Kraith doesn't trust humans. He never will. Rachel crossed her arms. Then what the hell do we offer him? Carter's expression hardened. Power. Rachel gave a short, bitter laugh. That's rich. You want us to give Kraith more power. I want us to remind him that we're the only ones who can keep him in power. She didn't argue, because they both knew it was true. The Drek'Kar had never lost a war, until now. If Kraith's empire was breaking, his enemies wouldn't just challenge him. They'd butcher him. Kraith wasn't just fighting Earth anymore. He was fighting to keep his throne. Rachel stared at Carter for a long moment, then shook her head. You have a bad habit of making enemies into allies. Carter didn't respond, because this wasn't an alliance. This was survival. And the only way forward was through the enemy's hands. Without another word, he strode toward the war room. Get me a channel to Kraith. Rachel blinked. You're calling him? Carter didn't slow his pace. If we don't, we'll be dead before the week is out. Rachel hesitated, then sighed. I swear one day this is going to get you killed. Carter smirked. Not today. And with that, the first step of the impossible plan was set in motion. The war room was silent except for the low hum of the comm system. Carter sat at the central console, eyes locked on the screen before him, establishing connection. The words pulsed in cold, white light, counting down the seconds before the impossible began. Rachel stood nearby, arms crossed. If this goes sideways, we're dead. Carter didn't look away. It was never going to be simple. Rachel scoffed. There's a difference between not simple and suicidal. You're asking the warlord of the Drekkar to consider a deal. That's like convincing a shark to stop swimming. Carter smirked. Everyone stops swimming when they realize the water is poisoned. A sharp beep signaled the connection had gone through. The screen flickered, static crackling, then resolved into an image. General Kraith, seated upon a throne of obsidian and metal, a towering presence even through the feed. His golden eyes burned with an intensity that had raised civilizations. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Kraith leaned forward, his voice a slow, measured growl. You have some nerve. Carter met his gaze without hesitation. You're not in a position to waste time on posturing. Kraith exhaled sharply, a sound close to amusement. You believe you understand my position, human? Carter steepled his fingers. I understand that you're not just fighting us anymore. You're fighting them. Kraith's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. The smallest shift, a calculation adjusting itself. Carter pressed forward. You wouldn't have retreated if you were certain of your fleet. If you were certain of your command. But you weren't, were you? He let the words settle. Your own kind is turning on you. Kraith was still. Then he leaned back, expression unreadable. You assume much. Carter tilted his head. You're still talking to me. That tells me everything I need to know. Rachel tensed. Kraith's gaze flicked toward her, reading her just as easily. Your species is bold. Reckless. Perhaps that is why you have survived longer than most. Carter exhaled. We survived because we know when to fight. And when to make a deal. Kraith's lip curled, his version of a smirk. You believe I would consider an alliance? You wouldn't have answered this call if you weren't already considering it, Carter said smoothly. Your empire is fracturing. If you fall, it won't be to us. It'll be to your own kind. And the next warlord won't hesitate to burn this planet just to prove his strength. Kraith's claws drummed against the armrest of his throne. He had already run this scenario in his mind, Carter could tell. He had seen the cracks forming, the weakness within his own forces, the growing whispers of dissent that had started even before Earth had resisted. This wasn't about power anymore. It was about survival. You offer me what? Kraith asked at last. Carter leaned forward, voice low and certain. We both know you don't need more warriors. You need leverage. You need a way to ensure that whoever is plotting against you doesn't get the chance to strike. We can give you that. Kraith narrowed his eyes. You presume I would trust a human to stabilize my empire? Carter's jaw tightened. I don't need you to trust me. I need you to see the alternative. Silence. The weight of it stretched between them. Then Kraith exhaled, slow and measured. And what, exactly, do you propose? Carter didn't let himself relax. This was the moment, the fragile, razor-thin space between life and death. We'll disrupt the coup before it fully takes root. We have access to intelligence networks, infiltrators who can move where your warriors can't. Kraith studied him, gold eyes unblinking. In exchange, Carter let the words settle before delivering the next blow. In exchange, Earth doesn't burn. Kraith let out a low, rumbling laugh. It wasn't the kind of laugh that promised amusement. It was the kind that meant he was considering something deeply, that his mind was pulling apart the threads of possibility. You believe you are in a position to negotiate the fate of your world? Carter didn't blink. Yes. Kraith watched him for a long moment, and for the first time, the warlord looked tired. Not weak, not broken, but a man carrying the weight of a crumbling empire on his back. Carter had seen that look before. He had worn it himself once. Finally, Kraith exhaled, the tension in his shoulders shifting, just slightly. You intrigue me, Carter. I get that a lot. Kratha's lips curled again, the closest thing his species had to a smirk. You understand that if you betray me, there will be no sanctuary in this galaxy. Carter's voice was steady. I understand that if I don't make this deal, there won't be a galaxy left to run to. A long silence. Then, Krath nodded once. The war had changed again. And this time, they would fight it together. The war room was quiet, but it was not peace. The moment the connection with General Krath severed, the silence turned heavy, pressing down on the air like a storm waiting to break. Commander Alex Carter remained still, his fingers drumming against the steel surface of the table, his mind already pushing ahead to the next move. Across from him, Rachel Vaughn let out a sharp breath, folding her arms. You just made a deal with a warlord, she muttered, shaking her head. And not just any warlord, the one who nearly wiped us out. Carter didn't look at her. Instead, he stared at the data tablet in front of him, the glow reflecting off his face. I made a deal to keep us from getting wiped out by someone worse. Rachel scoffed. That's an interesting way to justify it. The door slid open before she could say more. Colonel Whitaker entered, his expression carved from stone. The Strategic Command Division's highest-ranking officer in the room, Whitaker had been in more wars than most, but Carter had never seen his jaw set quite so tight. You've lost your goddamn mind, Whitaker said as he strode toward the table. His voice was edged with fury, but beneath it, Carter caught something else, something closer to fear. He tossed a tablet onto the table, the text flashing red. Encrypted reports, priority alert. We intercepted Drekkar transmissions, Whitaker said. Your theory was right. Kratha's empire is cracking. There's a faction inside his fleet, and they're moving fast. His second-in-command, High Commander Virex, is leading the charge. Carter barely blinked. How long do we have before the coup solidifies? Whitaker's jaw twitched. Virex hasn't struck yet, but he's consolidating power. If we don't act fast, Krath is done, and will be next. Rachel leaned forward. And what happens if Virex wins? Carter met her gaze, his expression unreadable. Then this isn't a war anymore. He tapped the tablet. It's eradication. Rachel stilled. Whitaker narrowed his eyes. You're sure about that? Carter exhaled slowly. Krath is brutal, but he fights to win, not to destroy. Virex? Virex doesn't conquer. He erases. A thick silence settled between them. Finally, Rachel spoke. How does someone like that rise through the Drekkar ranks? I thought Krath controlled everything. Carter shook his head. Krath rules by power. But power breeds resentment. Virex has been waiting for this moment, waiting for the first fracture in Kratha's command. The moment we pushed Krath back, that fracture turned into an opening. He clenched his jaw. And now Virex is stepping through it. Whitaker let out a slow breath. So let's say I don't throw you in a cell for even speaking to Krath. What's your plan? Carter didn't hesitate. We hit Virex first. Whitaker scoffed. Oh, brilliant. You want to assassinate the leader of a military coup inside an enemy fleet that's already looking to burn us to the ground. Yes. Rachel blinked. You didn't even hesitate. Carter turned to her. Because there's nothing else to consider. If Virex takes control, there is no version of this war where we survive. He looked back at Whitaker. We don't need to destroy his fleet. We just need to remove him. Whitaker leaned forward, studying him. And what happens if Krath turns on us after? Carter didn't blink. Then we kill him too. Rachel let out a quiet, almost disbelieving laugh. You're serious? Carter met her gaze, his voice calm, measured. I've never been more serious. Whitaker ran a hand down his face. And how exactly do you plan to kill the most powerful warlord in the galaxy if he decides to turn? Carter smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Because if we do this right, he'll never see it coming. Carter turned the tablet toward them, pulling up a detailed map of the Drekkar fleet's movements. One ship, marked in red, stood out from the rest. Rachel frowned. The Red Hand? Carter nodded. Virex's personal command ship. It's a Dreadnought-class battleship with its own elite guard, but that's also its weakness. He's isolating himself, pulling in only those he trusts. That means he's paranoid. And paranoia makes people predictable. Whitaker crossed his arms. How do we get in? Carter tapped the screen. Virex is recruiting mercenaries from fringe planets to bolster his forces. He doesn't trust Kratha's warriors completely, so he's looking for outside fighters to supplement his ranks. That's our way in. Rachel raised an eyebrow. You want us to pretend to be Drekkar mercenaries? Not us, Carter corrected. Me. Whitaker straightened. Absolutely not. Carter ignored him. Virex needs bodies, not loyalty. If I go in as a contracted soldier, I can get close enough to him before he realizes what's happening. Rachel's expression darkened. That's suicide. Not if I have an exit strategy. Whitaker stared at him. Do you? Carter hesitated. I will. Silence. Rachel exhaled, shaking her head. You have a bad habit of making enemies into allies. Carter picked up the tablet, eyes still fixed on Virex's location. And an even worse habit of making allies into corpses. Whitaker let out a slow grunt. We don't have time to argue about this. He sat down, fingers tapping against the metal table. High Command is still considering a full strike on Kratha's fleet. We've got 48 hours before they make a decision. Carter nodded. Then we move before they do. Rachel's voice was quieter now. And if Krath turns on us after we help him? Carter placed the tablet down with finality. Then we make sure he doesn't live long enough to regret it. No one argued, because they all knew the truth. The war had changed again. And this time, it wasn't just about winning. It was about who got to decide what the galaxy would look like when the dust settled. The red hand loomed ahead like a predator in the abyss, its hull a dark monolith against the backdrop of scattered stars. Its surface pulsed with deep crimson energy veins, glowing like molten iron beneath blackened steel. This was no ordinary dreadnought. It was a fortress, a command ship designed for absolute power, the heart of Virex's rebellion. And Carter was about to walk straight into its maw. He adjusted the collar of his stolen combat vest, a heavy Drekkar mercenary uniform he had scavenged from a dead warfighter in a skirmish long before Earth had been invaded. The fit was snug, the plating scratched, but it would pass. The visor built into the helmet's crest masked most of his face, though he had no doubt Virex's security would scan him the moment he stepped on board. That was a problem for later. For now, the priority was getting inside. The stolen shuttle rattled as it latched onto the docking bay, magnetic locks engaging with a dull thud. The ship's internal systems pulsed with an eerie red light, signaling that clearance had been granted. Carter exhaled, steadying his nerves. He had done infiltrations before, but never into a stronghold like this. A voice crackled through the comm embedded in his earpiece. Rachel. Final check. You still want to do this? Carter smirked. If I say no, you have a way to beam me out of here? Negative. Then there's no point in asking. A static-filled sigh. You have 30 minutes before Virex's officers realize something's off. If you're not back in that time frame, we assume you're dead. Carter rolled his shoulders. Appreciate the optimism. The ship's door hissed open, exposing the metallic expanse of the docking bay. Drekkar warriors moved through the cavernous space, their bodies clad in battle-scarred armor, their weapons slung across their backs in an air of tense readiness. These weren't soldiers, they were executioners, hand-picked by Virex to enforce his rule. Carter stepped onto the platform, keeping his posture rigid, but not aggressive, a mercenary's gait, someone used to war but not eager for attention. A figure broke from the gathered soldiers and strode toward him. A Drekkar officer, taller than most, his bronze-plated armor gleaming under the artificial light. His scarred jawline and slitted golden eyes marked him as a veteran. Identification, the officer growled, voice rough with suspicion. Carter handed over the data tag he had stolen. The officer scanned it. The pause. His eyes flickered with something unreadable before he handed it back. Human, he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for Carter to hear. Carter tensed, but he didn't react. The officer didn't call for guards, didn't raise a weapon, just stared at him for a fraction too long. Then he turned. Virex wants all new recruits checked before assignment. Follow. Carter kept his steps measured as he walked behind the officer, forcing his pulse to steady. He had planned for this, but plans meant nothing once boots hit the ground. The corridors of the Red Hand were oppressive, lined with looming statues of past Drekkar warlords, their faces chiseled into expressions of cruelty and dominance. The lights pulsed with an unsettling heartbeat rhythm, casting jagged shadows on the walls. Everything about this ship screamed intimidation, a floating temple of war designed to remind all who stepped aboard that power was the only law. Carter memorized every hallway, every possible exit. He was walking into the lion's den, but he wasn't planning on staying long. The officer led him into a chamber lined with holographic displays, each flickering with fleet positions, battle formations, and internal surveillance feeds. In the center stood a tall figure, draped in a cloak of deep crimson. His back was turned, but the moment Carter entered, the figure spoke, his voice like steel grating against stone. You wear the armor well, but you don't walk like a Drekkar. Carter stilled. Virex turned. The High Commander was taller than Kraith, but leaner, his form wrapped in armor that gleamed with a vicious, predatory elegance. His skin was darker than most Drekkar, his eyes a shade of pure silver, an anomaly among his kind. A sign of his bloodline, one of the old houses, the ones who had been exiled for being too ruthless, even by Drekkar standards. Virex studied Carter for a moment, then smiled. It was not a smile of amusement. It was the kind of smile a man gives when he sees something interesting right before he kills it. You're not here to fight for me, he said. Carter's hand inched toward the hidden blade in his gauntlet. That obvious? Virex exhaled through his nose. Kraith sent you, didn't he? Carter chuckled. Kraith wouldn't send me. Kraith barely tolerates me. Virex tilted his head, intrigued. Then why are you here? Carter took a calculated step forward. Because I know something you don't. The Drekkar warlord arched a brow, curiosity flickering across his face. And what's that? Carter moved fast. The blade flashed from his gauntlet, a precise strike aimed for Virex's throat. But Virex was faster. Before Carter's blade connected, a shockwave pulsed outward, sending Carter hurtling backward. His body slammed into the metal floor, his ribs screaming in protest. He barely had time to register the crackling energy field surrounding Virex before the warlord was on him. A hand clamped around his throat, hoisting him up like he weighed nothing. Silver eyes gleamed with amusement. Did you think you were the first to try? Virex murmured. Carter struggled, gripping the warlord's wrist, but Virex's strength was monstrous. His feet barely scraped the ground. I should kill you now, Virex mused. But you're far more interesting alive. The warlord turned, still holding him. A new sound filled the chamber, boots marching. The doors hissed open, and Carter's stomach dropped. A squad of elite Drekkar enforcers entered, weapons drawn. Behind them, walking with measured calm, was a figure Carter did not expect to see. Kraith. Carter's vision blurred at the edges as the warlord's golden gaze met his. Kraith exhaled, tilting his head. Carter, he mused. You should have let me handle this. Darkness pressed at the edges of Carter's mind. His last thought before losing consciousness was bitter. Betrayal was a game played by many, and he had just lost the first move.